You know that feeling, right? The roar of the crowd, the absolute thrill of a last-minute goal, global football. It's just this huge multi-billion-dollar spectacle.
Mhm.
It's passion, it's skill, yeah, but it's also incredible economic power.
Absolutely massive.
But what if I told you that underneath all that excitement, there's this complex world, sometimes pretty shady, actually, full of money, power, and some really surprising gaps in accountability?
Yeah, we're talking about huge sums changing hands.
Huge is right. Did you know, just in England, something like £980 million has been paid by the top 92 professional clubs to agents. Just since the 2008-2009 season, that's just one country.
And globally, it's even more staggering. Between 2013 and 2019, something like $1.59 billion paid as commission to club agents just for international transfers. Billion with a B.
Wow. Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into two areas that are, well, they're completely connected. And they're crucial if you want to understand the financial integrity of the game.
That's right. We're looking at the way football agents are regulated or maybe not regulated enough, and also the, frankly, astonishing lack of transparency when it comes to who actually owns the clubs.
Yeah, so our mission here is to unpack the rules, follow the money, look at the power dynamics behind it all, and give you a shortcut to really understanding these dark spaces or black boxes in football.
Get ready for maybe a few aha moments that might just change how you see the beautiful game.
Okay, let's pull back the curtain then. First up, the unseen players' football agents. Their story isn't just about big commissions. It's really about how one single legal ruling kind of changed everything and started their, well, meteoric rise.
Absolutely. The Bozeman ruling back in '93, that was a real game changer. Essentially, it meant players in the EU could move clubs for free when their contracts ended.
Right, no transfer fee.
Exactly. And it also got rid of quotas on foreign players. So suddenly you had way more players moving between clubs much more freely.
And that created a need for agents.
Precisely. The demand just surged. Players had more freedom, sure, but navigating all these potential moves, contracts, different leagues, it got much more complicated. Agents stepped into that gap.
Okay, so agents sound like, helpful guides in a tricky market.
Yeah.
Why the big fuss about regulating them then? Is the problem really the agents? Or is it something bigger in the system? Where are the market failures?
Well, there are a few key issues, and they do point to some fundamental challenges. The biggest one is probably what economists call information asymmetry,
Meaning?
meaning players, especially the young ones, or maybe those less experienced, they often just don't have the full picture. They don't know the market rates, the complex clauses and contracts.
So they hire an agent to help them figure it out. Makes sense.
Right. But here's where it gets really tricky. There's often a big information gap between the player and their own agent, too.
How so?
An agent's services are what we call experience goods. You only really know how good they are after you've used them, like signing a player. You pay the money, but you don't know if they'll score goals until they're actually playing.
Ah, okay. So you can't really test drive an agent
No.
before you trust them with your entire career.
Exactly that. And this leads to problems like adverse selection. It's just really hard to tell the good agents from the bad ones before you sign up, which can create this market for lemons scenario.
Like buying a dodgy used car.
Pretty much. If you can't tell the good from the bad easily, the bad ones can kind of drag the whole market down, making everyone wary. The lower quality services might even start to dominate.
So it's not just about competence, it's like a built-in trust issue. And what happens after a player signs with an agent? Is the problem solved then?
Not necessarily. That's where moral hazard comes in. Once that representation agreement is signed, there's a potential conflict of interest, right? The agent is supposed to act in the player's best interest, but they also have their own bottom line, their own financial incentives. They get paid, often a percentage of the deal.
Right, so they want the biggest deal possible.
Well, yes, but maybe not always the best deal for the player long term. They might push for a transfer that gives them a huge commission right now, even if it sends the player to a club where they won't fit in or won't develop properly.
So the agent pockets the cash, but the player takes the career risk.
That's the moral hazard, exactly. The agent's incentives aren't perfectly aligned with the player's best interests. They don't bear the consequences if it goes wrong for the player.
And I guess the fallout from bad agent behavior could spread beyond just the player involved, affect the wider game.
Oh, definitely. These are the negative externalities. Think about it. A star player's big transfer collapses because of, I don't know, agent incompetence or greed. That impacts the fans, the clubs involved, even the league's competitive balance.
Yeah, you can see that.
And then there are broader worries. Things like Agents trying to get players to break their contracts, maybe getting involved in tax evasion, or even worse, facilitating money laundering. All that stuff seriously damages the sport's reputation.
Which might explain why some Premier League managers have apparently called agents things like parasites or even mafiosos.
Ouch. Yeah, strong words, but they show the level of frustration from people inside the game.
Okay, so given all these pretty serious concerns, information gaps, moral hazard, damage to the game's reputation, you'd think regulation would be strong and consistent. But FIFA's journey here, it's been more like a pendulum, hasn't it? Back and forth.
It really has. They first brought in compulsory licenses for agents way back in 1991. You had to pass exams, meet certain ethical standards, financial standards.
Sounds sensible. What happened?
Well, the EU Commission raised concerns. They worried it was limiting access to the profession, maybe violating competition laws.
Ah, okay. But then, fast forward to 2015. If regulation seemed necessary, why did FIFA basically deregulate the whole thing with their regulations on working with intermediaries, the RWI? That feels like a complete U-turn.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah. What they did was scrap the compulsory license and replace it with just a basic registration. You just needed to show an impeccable reputation, whatever that means, and they recommended a 3% fee cap.
Recommended,
No.
not enforced.
Exactly, recommended. FIFA's thinking, or at least their stated aim, was to bring more agents under their umbrella. They estimated something like 70% of international deals involved unlicensed agents anyway. So the idea was, let's have looser rules, but at least get more people registered and sort of visible.
Did that work? What was the result of opening the floodgates like that?
Well, it was widely seen as a disaster, frankly. Critics called it a Wild West scenario. Lots of, let's say, unqualified people jumped into the market. Standards seemed to drop.
And the money. That recommended 3% cap.
Ignored, mostly. Fees absolutely rocketed, up 87% in just 4 years, from around $238 million in 2014 to $446 million in 2017. That 3% recommendation. In practice, 5% or even higher became pretty common. Plus, there were constant worries about lack of enforcement, agents poaching players under contract. It didn't really solve the problem.
So the Wild West era, it sounds like FIFA realized this wasn't working. What's the latest move? Are they swinging back the other way again?
They are. Because of all that criticism, FIFA approved new regulations, the football agent regulations, or FARR, back in December 2024. They're coming into force January 1st, 2025. And the big news...
Let me guess, licensing is back.
You got it. A significant return to a compulsory licensing requirement, plus stricter rules generally, and this is important, setting up a FIFA clearinghouse. The idea is to centralize and streamline payments for agent commissions, make things more transparent, and hopefully deter dodgy dealings.
Okay, so it's an admission that maybe deregulation went too far. They're trying to put the genie back in the bottle, maybe?
You could say that. Trying to regain control and raise standards again.
All right, so FIFA tries to set a global standard, fails, then tries again. But it gets even more complicated, doesn't it? Because individual countries have their own ideas about how to handle agents. It's like a legal patchwork quilt out there. Let's look at France first. How do they do things?
France is a really interesting contrast, especially to that 2015 FIFA deregulation phase. They never deregulated. They stuck with a very strict government-mandated licensing system under their sports law, the Code du Sport.
So proper exams and everything?
Yep, got to pass a written exam.
Yeah.
And get this, there's a complete ban on dual representation. An agent absolutely cannot represent both the player and the club in the same transfer. Plus, a 10% fee cap.
And if you operate without a license?
Serious trouble. Criminal penalties, fines, even potential prison time. They don't mess around.
Wow, okay, that's definitely strict. How does England compare? Is it similar?
Not really. England relies more on private regulation, mainly through Football Association, the FA. They basically adopted FIFA's 2015 registration system.
So no compulsory exam like in France?
No exam, but agents have to pass a test of good character. Dual representation is allowed, but only if everyone agrees and it's fully disclosed. That 3% FIFA fee cap is still technically recommended, but like we said, 5% or more is pretty standard in reality.
And payments.
They go through the FA's own clearinghouse system, and English common law applies, so agents have fiduciary duties they legally have to act in their client's best interest. It's more self-regulation within the football family, less direct government law.
Interesting difference.
What?
What about Italy? Did they follow FIFA's deregulation path, or did they have second thoughts?
They initially deregulated along with FIFA in 2015, but then the Italian government actually stepped back in. A budget law in 2017 brought back a habilitation exam for agents.
So they reverse course.
Seems like it. Agents now have to pass this exam and register with both the National Olympic Committee, ECONI, and the Italian Football Federation, FIGC. They also recommend the 3% cap and allow dual representation if there's consent. It really shows a national government reacting because they felt standards were dropping too much.
Okay, one more example. Belgium. How do they fit into this mixed picture?
Belgium's kind of a hybrid. They have regional laws requiring registration, for instance. In Flanders, you need a 25,000 financial guarantee. But they also have private rules from the Royal Belgian Football Association.
Any notable rules there?
Yeah, they actually got rid of an old 7% fee cap. But interestingly, they brought in a ban on agents charging commissions for any services provided to underage players, to minors. That's a key protection.
So looking across these countries, France, England, Italy, Belgium, you see this real mix. Strict licensing here, registration there, government versus private rules. It feels like a system full of potential loopholes.
It definitely creates complexity. You have this tension. Licensing creates high barriers to entry, which might keep some bad actors out, but also maybe some good ones. Registration is easier to get into, but then everything depends on monitoring and enforcement, which can be weak, especially if it's left to private bodies without strong legal teeth.
And whether any of these different approaches actually work well to fix those core problems? The information gaps, the conflicts of interest, that's still very much up for debate, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing challenge.
Okay, so if dodgy agents are one side of the financial integrity coin, the other side, maybe even murkier, is about the clubs themselves. Who actually owns them? Because what good are transparent agent fees if the money pouring into the club is coming from who knows where?
Exactly. This brings us to the often hidden structures of football club ownership. And there was this major global study in 2018, Legal, Financial, and Integrity Aspects of Club Ownership in Football. And its findings were, well, the report used the word astonishing regarding the lack of oversight.
Astonishing lack of oversight. What did they find?
Get this. Only 3 countries in the world have a specific body whose job it is to oversee investments and ownership specifically in football clubs. 3.
Out of all the countries playing football, that's tiny.
It gets worse. Only 2 countries globally are actually able to fully track and monitor the money trail behind club investments and ownership. Just 2.
Wow. So for the vast majority of the world's football clubs, nobody really knows where the money's ultimately coming from.
Pretty much. Most countries just don't have the specific tools. They rely on general company laws, or they kind of assume the regular club licensing process catches it, which it often doesn't, not in detail.
And identifying the actual person behind the money, the beneficial owner.
Huge problem. Even where clubs have to disclose ownership information, the study found that most countries still can't identify the ultimate beneficial owner, the real person pulling the strings. Only about 39% can, and even then, there are often loopholes or limitations.
And who's running these clubs? The board members.
Well, that's another major finding. 70% of the countries looked at have no fit and proper person test for board members of football clubs.
No check on whether the people running these multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar operations are suitable. That seems incredible.
It raises huge questions, doesn't it? Who are these people? What's their background? What's their agenda?
So this lack of transparency, this inability to see who owns what and why, it must create huge risks for the sport's integrity, right? It can't just be about messy finances.
Absolutely. It matters enormously because clubs sometimes get bought for, let's call them non-sporting reasons. It's not always about winning leagues or developing players.
Like what, for example?
Well, look at Italy's Serie A. The study noted 18 out of 20 clubs were family-owned. Now, family ownership isn't automatically bad, but sometimes these clubs are used more like propaganda tools.
Propaganda?
Yeah, by powerful business families. The club becomes a vehicle for boosting their social standing, their public image, maybe gaining political influence, or even driving growth in their other businesses indirectly. Running the club as a sustainable, independent entity isn't always the top priority.
It's about image and influence, not just football.
Often, yes. And this kind of opaque ownership, driven by non-sporting motives, opens the door to really serious risks.
Such as?
Money laundering is a big one. We saw the case with Birmingham City FC, remember? Their owner was arrested on money laundering charges back in Hong Kong. It also makes it easier to use complex webs of third-party investment funds to hide who the real owners are. And it can create vulnerabilities for things like sports betting fraud and match fixing. If you don't know who truly controls a club, how can you be sure decisions aren't being influenced improperly?
It's a recipe for trouble, basically. And it's striking, isn't it, that even FIFA itself hasn't been immune to criticism about transparency. It's not just the clubs.
That's true. Back in 2018, the president of the German Football Federation, Reinhard Grindel, publicly went after FIFA president Gianni Infantino
What about?
about a perceived lack of transparency around proposals for a new global nations league and a massively expanded Club World Cup. Grindel specifically flagged concerns about where the huge sums of money needed to finance these big new tournaments were coming from, who were the investors, what were their motives. It showed that even at the very top, these questions about money and transparency persist.
So we've got these major black holes, murky agent dealings, opaque club ownership, even questions at the highest level. What are people suggesting we actually do about it? What are the solutions being put forward?
Well, various experts and studies, like the one we mentioned, have put forward a range of ideas. Things like generally pushing for much greater transparency from clubs and leagues themselves.
Makes sense.
More robust financial supervision by the governing bodies, FIFA, confederations, national FAs, making sure football officials fully disclose their assets and any potential conflicts of interest.
Right. Accountability for the people in charge.
There's also talk of building a global club registry, like a central database to track ownership properly. And that idea of a transfer clearinghouse, which we saw FIFA bringing back for agents, is also suggested more broadly to track transfer money flows. Basically, it's all about shining a light into these dark corners.
Okay, so we've really dived deep today. We've looked at the whole roller coaster of agent regulation from licensing to deregulation and now swinging back again. And we've peered into the, frankly, alarming lack of transparency around who owns football clubs across the globe.
And the real aha moment, I think, is seeing just how linked these two things are. Regulating agents properly, making club ownership transparent. They're two sides of the same coin, really.
How so?
Because without strong, enforceable rules in both areas, you leave the door wide open. Open for agents to prioritize their own cut over a player's career, and open for clubs to be used for things that have nothing to do with sport, like laundering money or just boosting someone's ego or political influence. It's a systemic weakness.
And you mentioned the EU earlier, their role.
Yeah.
Even though sport isn't their main focus, they're still watching this space.
Yeah, the EU's power in sport directly is limited, but its rules on the internal market, on competition policy, those give it leverage. It means they continue to look closely at things like agent rules and ownership structures, so you might see more pressure, maybe even more coordinated action from the EU down the line. That could be significant.
Okay, so that leaves us with a final thought, really. A question for everyone listening, perhaps. Given everything we've discussed, the money, the lack of transparency, the potential for exploitation, what responsibility do we have as fans, as people involved in the football community? What's our role in demanding more transparency, more accountability to make sure the beautiful game stays, well, beautiful?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we protect the integrity and the spirit of the sport we all love?